Every summer the streets of Harlem transformed. The long, hot days brought people outside. Stoops became gathering places. Fire hydrants became swimming pools for children, and basketball courts became theaters where legends were made. None more legendary than Rucker Park. The court at 155th Street and Frederick Douglass Boulevard was sacred ground. Since the early 1960s, the tournament held there each summer had attracted the best basketball players in the world. Not just street players, not just local talent. Professional stars from the NBA would show up to test themselves against the competition. The crowd that gathered to watch these games was unlike anything else in sports. This was not a polite suburban audience. This was Harlem. When a player made an incredible move, the crowd erupted with an energy that you could feel in your chest. When someone missed an easy shot, the mockery was ruthless and immediate. Rucker Park was entertainment, competition, and community all wrapped into one explosive package. Frank Lucas had been coming to Rucker Park since he first arrived in Harlem, even before he had money, before he had power, before anyone knew his name. He would stand at the edge of the crowd and watch the games like everyone else. Something about the pure competition spoke to him. No politics, no manipulation, just talent and will determining who won and who lost. Now, of course, things were different. Frank did not stand at the edge of the crowd anymore. He had a spot near the front, where chairs were reserved for the important people. He arrived in expensive cars, surrounded by his men. When he entered Rucker Park, heads turned. Whispers spread. Everyone knew who Frank Lucas was. The summer tournament in question took place at the height of Frank's power. His organization was running smoothly. The alliance with the Italian families was producing excellent returns. The country boys had proven themselves in Queens. The streets were calm. Money was flowing. Life, by Frank's standards, was good. The game that afternoon was highly anticipated. Two neighborhood legends facing off in what everyone expected to be an epic battle. The crowd was enormous. Thousands of people packed into the space around the court. Standing room only stretched back for blocks. Frank arrived with four of his country boys, Hubert, Terrence, Jr., and a new addition, a young man named Samuel, who had proven himself reliable over the past year. They parked on 155th Street and walked toward the court, cutting through the crowd with the easy confidence of men who owned the neighborhood. Frank was in excellent spirits. The weather was perfect. The game promised to be exciting. He had no reason to think this afternoon would be any different from dozens of others he had spent at Rucker Park over the years. But something was different. Frank felt it before he could identify it. A prickling at the back of his neck. A subtle wrongness that he could not quite name. He had learned to trust these feelings. They had saved his life more than once. He slowed his pace slightly. His eyes began scanning the crowd more carefully, looking for what had triggered his instincts. At first, everything seemed normal. Families with children, groups of young men talking loudly about the upcoming game, vendors selling food and drinks. The usual Rucker Park scene. Then he saw it. Three men standing together near the edge of the court. They were not watching the warm-ups. They were watching Frank. When his eyes met theirs, they looked away quickly. Too quickly. Frank kept walking. He did not change his expression, did not signal to his men, did not do anything that would alert the watchers that they had been spotted. But his mind was racing. Three men, not from the neighborhood. He knew almost every face at Rucker Park. These were strangers. They were positioned between Frank and the exit he would normally use to leave. And now that he was looking, he noticed two more men on the other side of the court. Same stance, same watchful eyes, same deliberate positioning. 5 total. Maybe more he had not spotted yet. An ambush team, waiting for the right moment. Frank reached his usual spot near the front. He sat down calmly. His country boys took their positions around him. The game was about to begin. To any outside observer, Frank Lucas looked completely relaxed. A man enjoying a summer afternoon at the basketball court. Under the surface, he was calculating. The ambush team would not move during the game. Too many people, too much chaos. They would wait for Frank to leave, catch him in the transition between the crowded court and his car. That gave Frank time. Time to figure out who had sent these men. Time to plan a counter-move. Time to turn their trap into his advantage. He leaned toward Hubert, did not change his expression. Spoke so quietly that only Hubert could hear. "We have a problem. 5 men, maybe more. They are here for us." Hubert's face remained neutral. His eyes began their own scan of the crowd. "I see them," he confirmed after a moment. 2 by the north exit, 3 more near the concession stand. "What do you want to do, boss?" Frank watched the basketball game for a few moments. The players were warming up. The energy of the crowd was building. Nobody suspected that something far more dangerous than a basketball game was developing. "Get word to the others," Frank said. "I want our people at every exit. Not to confront, just to watch. And I want a car brought around to 156th Street, back entrance." Hubert nodded almost imperceptibly and began moving among the country boys, passing the message. Frank turned his attention back to the game. The tip-off was moments away. He would watch. He would enjoy. He would give no sign that he knew what was waiting for him. The game that followed was spectacular. 2 of the best players in the city going head-to-head. The crowd was in a frenzy. Frank allowed himself to be caught up in the moment, even as part of his mind remained focused on the threat. By halftime, the score was tied. The crowd was buzzing with anticipation for the second half. Frank's men had completed their reconnaissance. The full picture was worse than expected. At least 8 men, positioned at every major exit. Whoever had planned this had done their homework. They knew Frank's habits. They knew which exits he typically used. They had covered all of them. All except one. The back entrance on 156th Street was a service entrance, not usually accessible to the public. But Frank owned a property nearby. He knew the building's superintendent. He had used that entrance before, years ago when he was still learning the neighborhood. The ambush team did not know about it. Or if they did, they had not bothered to cover it. Frank made his decision. He would leave at the beginning of the second half, while the crowd was focused on the game, while the ambush team was waiting for the normal end. He would walk out the back way, get in his car, and disappear before they realized he was gone. But that was not enough. Frank Lucas did not just escape traps. He turned them around. He sent messages. Anyone who came for him needed to understand the cost of failure. He pulled Hubert close again. "When I leave, I want you to stay. I want you to identify every single one of these men. Follow them when they realize I am gone. Find out who sent them. And then we will have a conversation with those people." Hubert nodded. "Understood, boss." The second half began. The crowd roared. Frank stood up casually, stretched, said something to the men around him about finding a restroom. Nobody in the crowd noticed. Nobody in the ambush team noticed. They were watching the exits, not Frank's seat. He moved through the crowd slowly, greeting people he knew, stopping to shake hands with a neighborhood elder, taking his time, looking completely natural. By the time he reached the service entrance, he was alone. The door was unlocked, as promised. The superintendent had received a generous tip to ensure it would be. Frank stepped through and found his car waiting on 156th Street, engine running, driver ready. He climbed in and was gone before the third quarter ended. The ambush team waited until the final buzzer. They watched the crowd stream out. They watched Frank's empty seat remain empty. By the time they realized what had happened, Frank was back in the heart of his territory, surrounded by his men, planning his response. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Hubert followed the ambush team back to their base of operations, a building in the Bronx that belonged to a minor player Frank had never heard of. Someone who thought they could make a name by taking out the biggest target in Harlem. Frank did not respond with violence. Not directly. He responded with economics. Within a week, the minor player found himself cut off from every supplier in the city. His operations dried up overnight. His men, unpaid and uncertain, began to desert. His building in the Bronx was somehow purchased by a mysterious buyer who immediately raised the rent to an impossible level. By the end of the month, the man who had tried to ambush Frank Lucas at Rucker Park was finished. Not eliminated, something worse, made irrelevant, forgotten, erased from the game entirely. The stories spread through the streets. Frank Lucas saw an ambush coming before it happened. He walked right through their trap without them even knowing. And then he destroyed the man who sent them without lifting a finger. Legend status. The kind of reputation that made enemies think twice, that made potential rivals reconsider their ambitions, that made Frank Lucas something more than just a successful criminal. He was becoming a symbol, a myth, a name that carried weight beyond anything he had ever imagined. But myths attract attention, and not just from the streets. Somewhere in the city, in an office far from Harlem, people in positions of authority were taking notice. They were building a case. They were gathering evidence. They were preparing to bring Frank Lucas down. The quiet period after Rucker Park was the last peace Frank would know for a long time, because the storm that was coming would not come from rivals or enemies on the street. It would come from the law, and when it came, it would change everything. Next time on Frank Lucas Chronicles: the arrest, the trial, Rikers Island. Frank Lucas was about to learn that surviving in prison required a different kind of strength. And on his first day inside, he would face a challenge that would determine whether he lived or died. That story is coming in Part 9.